Hi, welcome to the channel, Pilgrim of the New Jerusalem. And yes, my name is Christian, and I am a Christian, or at least I try to be daily. It's very hard. It's very challenging. There's so many things that challenge our faith, whether it's health issues, financial issues, whether it's just even debates and arguments. But our faith is built on something much stronger than that, and that's why this channel exists to encourage people who believe, encourage people who are struggling, encourage um, people to contend once for all for the faith delivered to the saints, as it says in Jude. And we're really all on pilgrimage, whether we like it or not. Every single day, we're one day closer to either the coming of Christ or our passing. Right? Nobody escapes either of those two events. So we're traveling, and let's not get stuck on our journey. Let's find ways to. If we are stuck, let's lift each other up. Let's be faithful. And I say that to myself because every single day it's hard. It's a tough world we live in, and there's so many topics that I want to discuss, right? I could think of a million different things to talk about. There's history, there's culture, I don't want to get too much into the politics, right? But that's not the goal of this channel. This is more theological, but there's so many aspects that we can discuss, so many challenges, so many questions, so many even denominations or interpretations of different groups. So, how do we build a strong foundation, right? Well, I think part of that is definitely studying the scriptures. I have I have several versions here. Like I have a Septuagint, for example, of the Old Testament. I've got the New Testament as well. And before we dive into, what is the Septuagint? What is the Masoretic text? What is this? What is that? Um, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the topic of today, and that's really studying the church fathers. And you may say, well, I have enough reading the Bible, right? The Bible is huge, and it takes months and years. I haven't completed the entire Bible, right? I'm just reading through it, reading through various parts of it. So I'll be the first to admit, even growing up as a Christian, completing the Bible is a task that I'm working on at this moment. But it's not just so I can say, "Oh, I read this and now it's under my belt." I want to really understand what I'm reading. I want to digest, and I want to see what God opens up, right? Because there are so many challenges. Like I've been stuck through the desert. I feel like I was like the Israelites, stuck for 40 years. Except I was stuck for 4 years, reading through Leviticus and Numbers, and it was a challenge. But there's so much truth, so much wisdom in Leviticus. You would be surprised. And so why am I going to just throw the church fathers on top of that, right? I should just focus on the Word of God and don't even take other literature into consideration. But the reality is, a lot of our core beliefs, those were wrestled out, right? Those were people that were close to the time of the apostles, who who also were educated men, who were not that educated either. There were some that were not educated, and there were some that were very educated. So it's not about that. It's about understanding, how did these men that were so close to the time of the apostles, who spoke Koine Greek, for example, who lived in the apostolic world, a world very different, a Greco-Roman world, very different from our own, and that's not even including Egypt or the the Aramaic speaking parts, like in Syria, modern day, what would be modern day Iraq, where Babylon is. Or Christianity went that way. The apostles went that way. The apostles went westward, and they went down to towards Egypt. So there's so much that was written in so many centuries. So where do we all start? You know, there is no right or wrong, right? Some people say, well, start chronologically, like read the letters of Saint Ignatius of Antioch. I have his book. It is a really awesome book. There's several epistles that he wrote, and you get a huge sense of just his faith. This was a man of faith. He was a bishop of Antioch, which we all know Antioch, right? That was in the New Testament. That's where Paul. It says in that the people were the Christians were first called Christians in Antioch, right? So people believe that maybe Matthew was written in Antioch. Um, Peter. more than likely was in Antioch. So when the persecution in Jerusalem happened, that was the next city that really had a strong Christian presence. And so, what about reading something like a Saint Ignatius of Antioch? I think that's a great idea. It's a great place to start because you see so much theology in his writings. Like, and there's a lot of skeptics out there. They're like, oh, Christians didn't believe that, but he literally he mentions Christ's blood as the blood of God, and he has and so here's this man that's imprisoned, and he's on his way to Rome to be martyred, to be thrown to the lions, and he writes beautiful epistles to each of the churches, just like what Paul did, right? He wrote to the Philippians, to the Galatians. Well, that's Paul, right? But he writes to the Romans. He writes to the Ephesians. He writes to some of the same churches, and in addition to other Christian communities in Asia Minor, like the Magnesians. And each of his letters is dealing with different topics and issues. So I think Saint Ignatius of Antioch is a great start. Like I like this version because I can see the Greek text. If you study Greek, you have this Greek text right there, and it's very close to Koine. It is Koine Greek because he's literally writing a century within the century of the death and resurrection of Christ. He's probably writing maybe 70 or 80 years. So he's living, well, some people say a little bit further. So maybe he's in the early 110, early 120. So just depending which scholar you look at. But regardless, that's a great place to start because they're short, they're sweet, they're short and sweet. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean it in the sense that you can really just digest, right? Like he says, my desire is crucified, and there is no love of the material burning in me. Rather, there is living water speaking in me, saying to me within, come to the Father. So he says, I have no pleasure in corruptible food, nor in the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, of the seed of David. I desire his blood for my drink, which is incorruptible love. So you just see Eucharistic language. You see, and if you're a Protestant, like, hey, I'm basically a Protestant still at this point in my life. I can't say I'm something different, but you start to see, like, wait a second, this is really interesting. This is intriguing, and even if you don't necessarily agree with everything uh, a church father says, that's okay. Like, even if even Roman Catholics, even Orthodox, even different groups, everybody looks at and they don't, because it's not based on just what one person says, but it's an amazing, astounding historical witness to the faith. So I really, and maybe you'll be convinced. That's like I'm convinced of some truths that I've read. So I would say Saint Ignatius of Antioch is a good place to start. He's very early. The letters are not that long, and you can really sense his heart, right? This is a man who loves Jesus Christ, who is believed to have been to have known one of to I and there's different perspectives on that. Some people say that he knew one of the apostles. Others say no, he knew an apostle of the apostle. But regardless, he may have very well known the apostles. And there is even a tradition that says that he's the little child that Jesus carried. Right? There's a verse in the gospel where Jesus picks up a child, and that's why he's called uh, Ignatius of Antioch, also known as Theophoros. The bear of God. So so some people believe that he was that's an early tradition too. So that's a great place to start. My personal favorite is Saint Gregory the theologian, right? And why do I say that? Because so Saint Gregory is much later than Saint Ignatius, but at the same time he's called Saint Gregory the theologian for a reason. He just has this beautiful Christology, right? And he's a man, and part of the thing about the church fathers is what you start to love about them is, yes, they're men, right? And maybe they weren't apostles, which and maybe they're a bit removed from the apostles, but they're still carrying that apostolic tradition from generation to generation, and the humility, like Saint Gregory in particular. He wanted to be away from the limelight. He didn't want to be the bishop. He didn't want to be in the capital of the empire. on multiple occasions he wanted to just be a monk in solitude, and he was basically forced because at that time he was forced by the people who had a strong view of Christology, who had a strong view of who Christ was, versus the new heresy of like Arianism. So I personally like Saint Gregory, the theologian. Saint Gregory of Nyssa is awesome. To actually have, um, and I've got a few books here, but I like this one was a really cool one. It's a catechetical discourse, and so it's Gregory writing to the early converts of Christianity, explaining different theology. Like this blew my mind. This is not Gregory the theologian. This is Gregory of Nyssa, who knew Gregory the theologian. So it's really cool because some of these men, they knew each other. Actually, he was really good friends. Saint Gregory the theologian was really good friends with Saint Gregory of Nyssa's brother, Saint Basil, and they all studied together. And they were in Athens, and then it just goes on and on. Like they were with this guy. They studied with the guy in Athens who later becomes the emperor, who apostatized, who rejects Christ, who wants to go back to the paganism. So imagine your classmate is the greatest defender of Christ's divinity, and then the other guys becomes like a Roman emperor who says, "Hey, I'm going back to idolatry." But that's the way of life, right? Like we have people that start off the same place and end in two very different places, right? So, and but that's and maybe and they experience the same teaching, but Saint Gregory was able to filter the good of the pagan philosophy, whereas Julian the apostate wanted to do the opposite, right? He wanted to go back to the old ways, and I think once part of the beauty of studying the church fathers is that you see the heart of these men, you see the lives, you see just like Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. You see these men, these humble men who really were striving for the truth while you're alongside them learning and absorbing, because really the theology of Saint Gregory is the theology of the Nicene Creed, and not it's not only him, right? It's all of what's called the Cappadocian, and you can't go wrong studying the Cappadocians. I say Saint Gregory the theologian because he has a list of 40 orations, and those orations are really good because it gives you a sense of his life. It gives you a sense of the theology. So it's really interesting. Like he's giving a funeral oration, right? Which is basically a eulogy. He's giving a eulogy for his sister, for his other brother, and he's just like throwing Trinitarian truths in there. Like so, it's really interesting because you're giving a funeral eulogy about somebody who passed, but you're also diving into complex theology at the same time. And so some of those are just his sermons. Some of them are letters. He has very famous. The five theological orations are very famous. But I say that's where I think that's not a bad place to start. Athanasius is another great place to start. He's earlier, Saint Athanasius, but he also wrote on the Incarnation, and there's so many nuggets of truth, and not even nuggets. There's just I don't I know that's an expression, but there's so much truth in each of those church fathers, and this is not to dissuade you or to make you, oh, you need to become this or become that. Each person is guided by Christ and his walk. I'm certainly no one because I'm in no one to judge or no one to tell anyone what to do. I'm doing my walk. I'm figuring this stuff out alongside my family and alongside um, trying to process. Okay, what does this mean? Why do they believe this? Why do we believe that? And that's a process and a journey. So I think the church fathers, people have their own ones that some people love St. Augustine and they say, we'll start there. St. Augustine's a great place to start too. I think it's a little different, his style, and he's got the Confessions, which is autobiographical in nature. Some people consider that the first autobiography, um, where he just writes about his life. He writes about his struggles. Um, he also interestingly writes how he didn't like learning Greek, right? He had a tutor and he really just disliked learning Greek. I think because of the tutor, as a matter of fact. But why do I mention that? It's not to say that the Latin fathers are wrong. Of course not. The Latin fathers, like St. Ambrose of Milan, is amazing too. And so there's just so many of fathers in both camps. The reason I like some of the Greek fathers in particular, is because they're reading the New Testament in their own language and they understand it. So I remember I've even had arguments with people. This was one time. I don't really argue that much, but there's somebody trying to argue some point about the grammar from John 8, and where he where he says where Christ says, "I am," right, where he calls himself "I am," and and you can pull up John Chrysostom. This person's arguing about the grammar of the Greek. You just pull up John Chrysostom's commentary on it, Saint John Chrysostom, and he literally writes, "Oh, this is why he said this." And he's writing it in Greek and reposting it in Greek. I mean, not reposting. What am I saying? He's not on social media. I mean, he's he's paraphrasing and he's explaining and he's giving you exegetical insight into why it was written that way, what it means. So you're not arguing with some guy with like 2 years of Greek from college. You're arguing with, I mean, you're reading people who spoke the language on a daily basis, were highly educated. I believe in the case of Saint Gregory specifically, he actually wrote poems in like Homeric Greek. I've heard so some of these men not only knew the Greek of their time, they knew it. They were studied in the classics. They knew like they knew the Iliad and the Odyssey. They knew all of that culture, and so that's why I particularly like looking at that because it gives you you're now reading people who actually spoke and knew the language very intimately. It was their native language. So, but like I said, everybody has it. They're all good to read, right? Like Saint Gregory of Nyssa is awesome, right? The Catechetical Discourse. This blew my mind just reading the first few chapters. Like it made me like I never understood the Trinity the way until it was explained to me. Like he calls Christ. What does it mean? Christ is the Word of God, right? He goes into that and he says, for example, just like the Word reflects our mind, Christ being when we speak, right? I'm speaking right now. It's obviously what's reflecting what's in my mind, and in the same way, Christ, the Word, is reflecting the mind of the Father, and it's identical to His thoughts, even though He's the Word. And then He's like, as you're speaking, you're not only using words, but you're breathing, and so He's comparing the Holy Spirit as just human breath accompanying with your words. So, and the Father being the mind. So it's just like amazing, like. I'd never heard of any of those points, and in part that's because I've been. I'm not going to go too much into my story, uh, but I will say, no, you're not going to hear that like at a church on Sunday, right? And you're not ever going to hear of most of these people. If anything, even in the Western tradition, we just hear about Saint Augustine. We may hear of Saint Ambrose of Milan, or like Saint Benedict. If but that's different. That's mainly because of the monasticism and his rules. We may hear of Saint Basil, but a lot of people will miss. Um, will miss the depth of these were very highly educated theologians, and not only were they just book like we say, oh, they're theologians, right? They were monks. They were like Saint John Chrysostom. He was the bishop of Antioch. He was like starving himself in a cave basically before he actually and when I say starving, I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. I mean he fasted so much that he contracted an illness and he had to go back down to Antioch because of that illness. So these were people that were fasting and praying without ceasing. And so I would say um, a good one. I would, if somebody said, what should I read first? My personal one is On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. I know I said I really like St. Gregory, the theologian, which I highly recommend as well. But if you want a good starting one, I would say St. Athanasius, and then moving to St. Gregory the theologian, and then maybe incorporating St. Basil and then St. Gregory of Nyssa, which they were brothers, right? The Cappadocian, and then St. John Chrysostom. So those early fathers are really great. St. John Chrysostom has a lot of really good biblical commentary. So there's his commentary on Matthew is very famous. It's very extensive. it's just, there's just a breadth of knowledge and wisdom that we can obtain. So, and of course, I don't want to leave out the early fathers. We can always go to the pre-Nicene. Some people want to do that, like Ignatius of Antioch. There's Saint Justin the philosopher, as he's known, and he wrote several treatises defending the Christian faith. There is Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, and so there's different. Which he was an earlier church father. So some people want to say, "Hey, I want to read those guys," and that's fine too. Like they're really great. They're really great. Now some of them are going to be more like battling heresy, specific heresies, like and you see that in all of the ages, right? Why did these men write? A lot of them were just writing because they were facing issues of heresy, right? It's like today, like who, what do people combat today? They combat depending on which Christian group you're a part of, right? Like people combat the prosperity stuff. People combat the different views on human sexuality, like the different opinions in the church that creep in. People just write against that. So these men were writing more, and those are theological innovations because if you do change what the what it means, the anthropology of man, then you start to change the theology, like, and it really goes through. You make small changes, thinking it's no big deal, and it impacts the entire theology. So in every age, there was something different that they were battling with, right? So one sometimes they'll fix an issue, and then somebody will go to the other extreme, right? So you have like Nestorius going, you have Saint Cyril correcting Nestorius, but and then you have the backlash against that, and then Arianism, and then so you just have, and you'll get to know these people, right? These famous, 'cause just like you have the famous church fathers, you have the famous heretics, and you get to learn, and so yeah, I would say definitely always make the Bible the main focus of the reading because they were reading the Bible too. They were commenting on the Bible, so the Bible is our source of truth, right? And and Christ also, but Christ also said that the Holy Spirit speaking through Paul said that also the church is the pillar and foundation of truth. So we have to keep that in mind, right? That that God also provided his with his apostles and their descendants, quote unquote. He provided truth, and they safeguarded these texts. They safeguarded the truth of the church because the text can be interpreted in many different ways. So they safeguarded the tradition and the right interpretation, and they fought long and hard. So I'm just curious, what's your favorite church father, or who would you recommend to somebody that's beginning to read? I'd love to see that in the comments. Thank you.